the atoms radiate, electrons drop from one energy level to another without cause. Nuclear decays happen without cause. And when that occurs, when a nuclear decay occurs, for example, consider beta decay of a nucleus, an electron is produced that did not previously exist, and it's produced without any cause. Now, the cosmological argument has been Dr. Craig's standby for probably 30 or 40 years now. He's that old, he doesn't look that old. I think it's been around that long. And it's basically that the Big Bang is evidence that the universe must have had a beginning. Well, while the Big Bang marked the beginning of our universe, there could have been an earlier universe. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there are several published scenarios in peer-reviewed journals by reputable cosmologists, including Stephen Hawking, that show how our universe could have come about purely naturally. These scenarios are completely consistent with all we know about physics and cosmology. And if Hawking may have once said that there had to be a beginning of time, he certainly doesn't say that now, and he hasn't said it for a long time. Now, let me show you how that argument comes about. Almost every theist book you read these days uses Dr. Craig's cosmological argument that time must have begun with the Big Bang. This is based on the notion that the universe started out as a singularity of infinitesimal size and infinite density. Here's that word, infinite. So time must have itself have begun at that point. This was shown to be a consequence of Einstein's general theory of relativity by Hawking and Penrose way back in 1970, 40 years ago. Hawking and others later showed that quantum mechanical effects will prevent the singularity. Einstein's theory of general relativity is not a quantum theory. I refer you to page 50 of Hawking's bestseller, which is already 22 years old now, The Brief History of Time. He jokes that he first became famous for showing there's a singularity, and then for showing there wasn't one. The fact is that most cosmologists, in fact, I don't know a single working cosmologist today who believes that there was a singularity prior to the Big Bang. And if there wasn't a singularity, then there's no basis for arguing that time began at that point. There's no reason from cosmology that we know of that the universe can't be eternal. And incidentally, when I talk about an eternal universe, I don't mean an infinite universe. The whole term infinity is a very poorly used term in science very often. When I talk about an eternal universe, I mean a universe that had no beginning or end, not a beginning an infinite time ago. So when I talk about an eternal universe, say it's just like talking about last year. A year ago, it was 365 days counted on the clock. If we count back a billion years, the time between a billion years and now is a billion years, not infinity. So there's no argument you can give of that sort that says that the universe had to have a beginning. All right. Now, one of the models that I mentioned that has been published is the Hartle-Hawking, James Hartle, Stephen Hawking model called the no-boundary model. And in it, the universe doesn't have a beginning. The modern cosmology suggests that a greater eternal universe exists in which the Big Bang is just the origin of our particular baby universe. Now, I don't understand the way Dr. Craig tries to belittle all this cosmology. Cosmology now is very well established. We have wonderful data, and we can talk about the universe having no particular beginning in a way that's totally consistent with everything that we know. It doesn't violate anything. And he misrepresents my argument about zero energy. I don't use the zero energy argument to say that the universe didn't have a cause. I just use the zero energy argument to show that there was no violation of energy conservation from a universe coming from nothing. And now, well, if he doesn't like my characterization of nothing as this chaotic region that existed very early in our universe, okay, I'll just call it a chaotic region that existed very early in the universe. Nevertheless, that transition from that region to the current universe is something that we can model. We have models that have been published, as I already mentioned. You find it in one of my books that I didn't invent, it's from the literature, that take this into account, that show you exactly how the universe could have tumbled from a previous universe, for example, or just from a region of chaos. And he mentions people like Valentin. Well, Valentin is one of the people who developed these models. And that paper that he mentioned by Valentin that says that the universe had to have a beginning is counteracted by other papers. In fact, if you look at, unfortunately I didn't bring the paper with me, but if you look at the very last reference in that paper, you'll find a reference to another paper that gives an alternate explanation. So there's really nothing in cosmology that requires that the universe. That's just the opinion of one group of people, and they haven't proven that to the satisfaction of everybody else in the field. Now, let me get on to some other things here. Let's get on to the moral arguments. Since subjective morals exist, Dr. Craig says God must exist. Well, here Dr. Craig uses the argument from ignorance. I can't possibly see how objective morality could come about without God, therefore God must exist. Now, governments pass laws all the time that are perfectly objective. So why couldn't humanity be able to produce the same thing for moral laws? Dr. Craig has too little respect for the human intellect. Objective just means that most people agree on it. It doesn't mean that it depends on a particular person. Or it means that it doesn't depend on a particular person. It's not independent of all persons. Now, I don't need God to tell me that slavery and the subjugation of women is wrong, and that treating everyone as I would want to be treated myself is right. Confucius and Buddha said that 500 years before Christ. And furthermore, the Bible condones slavery and the subjugation of women. The Bible is not a good source of morality, and certainly atheists do not behave any more poorly than theists. There are surveys that show that there's hardly any difference in the moral beliefs of atheists and believers. There's a huge literature on the natural evolution of morals. It's not just necessarily from evolution. Society itself can evolve. And notable scholars such as Daniel Dennett, Pascal Boyers, Scott Petran have shown that there are many ways that morality could evolve without God. Finally, the historical facts about Jesus and the resurrection. At the time of Jesus' crucifixion, there were many active Roman historians, including Philo of Judea in Jerusalem. If a Palestinian rebel had been executed by Roman authorities, surely someone would have noticed that. Someone would have written about it, and no one has. The historicity of the empty tomb is doubtful. It doesn't appear in the New Testament outside the Gospels. Paul doesn't mention it. Noted biblical scholars who do not believe in the story of the empty tomb, that the story is historical, include Gunther Bornkamm, Rudolf Bultmann, John Dominic Crossan, Hans Kuhn, and Gerd Ludemann. In fact, I have a list of 30 published New Testament scholars who don't believe in the empty tomb story. So Christianity was just one of the many cults of the Roman Empire at the time of Constantine. It only survived because the Roman Emperor found it useful. When he took over when Christianity took over the empire, Christians made sure that they suppressed all the other religions, destroying many temples with wonderful works of art. They were the Taliban of the ages. Thank you.
In my rebuttal speech, I want to review those 6 reasons I gave for God's existence in light of Dr. Stinger's critique. First, the ontological argument. Here Dr. Stinger responds that he's a scientist, not a philosopher, and that therefore he doesn't know what to say in response to this. Now, what needs to be emphasized here is that all of the arguments I've presented are philosophical arguments. Science, at best, serves as evidence for one of the premises in a philosophical argument leading to a theological conclusion. So all of these arguments are philosophy, and you can't get out of them simply by saying you're not a philosopher. He said, well, couldn't you have a parallel argument for the greatest possible pizza? No, because the notion of the greatest possible pizza is logically incoherent. A greatest possible pizza would be metaphysically necessary in its existence, and therefore it could not be eaten. And therefore, it couldn't be a pizza, because the pizza can be eaten. He says, but from logic alone, you can't prove anything. Well, given that first premise, the conclusion does follow. It all depends on whether or not you think that God's existence is possible. And so it's not enough to be an atheist to say God doesn't exist. You've got to bite the bullet and say it's impossible that God exists. And I don't see any good reason to think that. The concept of God seems logically coherent, but then it follows logically that God does exist. What about the contingency argument? Here, Dr. Stinger didn't respond to anything in his last speech. Remember, I showed that nothingness is not the default position, that nothingness couldn't have an explanation, but if something exists, then that cries out for an explanation, and there was no response from Dr. Stinger on that argument. Thirdly, the cosmological argument. The first premise, you remember, was that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And here Dr. Stinger says things in quantum mechanics can happen without a cause. I'm afraid that there's no good reason to think that that is true. There's no good reason to think that an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics is true. There are at least 10 different interpretations of the equations of quantum mechanics, some of which are fully deterministic, and nobody knows which one is true. Dr. Stinger himself admits in his book, and I quote, other viable interpretations of quantum mechanics remain with no consensus on which, if any, is the correct one. So, he says, we have to remain open to the possibility that causes may someday be found for such phenomena. So it's not a proven counterexample. Besides, in quantum mechanics, as I've already explained, particles don't come into being out of nothing. They come out of the quantum vacuum as fluctuations of the energy that is locked up in the vacuum, and the vacuum is not nothing. Dr. Stinger in his last speech admits that if the universe does have zero energy on balance, that doesn't mean it doesn't have to have a cause. You still need a cause, and I proved then that the quantum vacuum cannot be eternal. With respect to the premise that the universe began to exist, he says, oh, but there are reputable models without a beginning. You don't need to have a singularity at the beginning of the universe, as in the Hartle-Hawking model. My argument doesn't depend on there being a singularity. In my opening speech, you remember, I quoted from Stephen Hawking's book, The Nature of Space and Time, 1996. That's well after his Hartle-Hawking model in 1983, in which he says that the universe does have a beginning and time has a beginning. John Barrow, a British physicist, in his book, Theories of Everything, with regard to the Hartle-Hawking model, says this type of quantum universe has not always existed. It comes into being, just as the classical cosmologies could, but it does not start at a Big Bang where physical quantities are infinite. So it still has a beginning, it just doesn't have a singular beginning. Therefore, as P.C.W. Davies writes in his book About Time, many people mistakenly suppose that Hawking has done away with the origin of the universe. This is quite wrong. In his model, time is definitely bounded in duration. So Davies concludes that recent ideas in quantum physics have changed our picture of the origin of the universe somewhat, but he